I think in my last video I was talking about this term knowledge, and now for me at least, this term knowledge contains within itself the idea of an embodiment, of a relationship to a knower, and the other terms perhaps don't. And in that video I talked about data and information as terms which aren't quite so suggestive of this active agent who's carrying out this act of knowledge, act of knowing. But as I was saying there, that doesn't take away that whole problem of whether there is such a thing as transcendent knowledge, and just changing its name to data or information doesn't alter the problem. It just recasts it in different terms. So, does something like data, does something like information exist prior to the act of knowing, which turns that information into knowledge, if I want to think of it in those terms, which brings it into the body of the knower, incorporates it into a body of knowledge that exists within the body of the individual? It doesn't answer that question at all. So that's the question I'm trying to wrap my head around, really. And the way I'm approaching it right now is thinking about the relationships between embodiment and objects, and then those conceptual objects that we think of as either knowledge or data or information, that kind of thing. And the point of contact I found is what I'm thinking of as a sort of middle term between physical objects, which have this kind of prototypical quality of existing outside of ourselves. This morning I was talking about a cup. Here's another cup. And we unproblematically, or at least I unproblematically assumed that cup is there even when I don't exist, and kind of has this transcendent existence outside of human awareness. Although I want to come on to question that. But if that's a kind of prototypical example of something which exists outside of, as I say, of human agency and human relationship, and if that's the kind of relationship that I'm trying to think of in terms of knowledge, or if that's the kind of existence which transcendent knowledge claims to have, empirical facts exist in the universe, kind of in the same way that cups exist in the universe. That's the kind of analogy I'm making there. As I say, I'm trying to find a middle term between that and this slightly more hazy existence that knowledge has. So somewhere between cups and data, that's where I'm trying to find. And the thing I've got in the middle term I've got right now for myself is something to do with feelings or emotions. Because I want something that has a kind of ontological certainty to it, a kind of undeniability, but also can be reduced in interesting ways. And I think feelings, for me at least, fit that bill. Because I think when you are feeling something like anger or joy or whatever, any kind of emotion, fear, it's completely real. You can't deny. There's an undeniable, self-evident quality to it. It's probably one of the nearest things that we have to a kind of Cartesian certainty. You can doubt lots of things, but you can't doubt the reality of the emotional moment that you are kind of grasping at that moment. So that as an example of a kind of object, if you like, a conceptual object, I think an emotion is a good candidate. But it's a funny candidate because William James had some interesting things to say about emotions, feelings, and a lot of work's been done on that since. And what he says is that he invites you to imagine having an emotion like anger. So there it is, there's your anger, and you're feeling it, and it's real. And then he says, imagine taking away the sensory supports for that anger. So there's your anger, and you're imagining this tension in your shoulders, and you release the tension in your shoulders. So that particular kind of somatic contribution, if you like, to the anger has disappeared. And then you imagine the kind of flushed pressure in your face that you're feeling, and you imagine that disappearing, and you've still got the anger. And then you imagine all the tension in the rest of your body disappearing. And then you imagine your heart rate dropping to normal levels. You imagine the tension in your jaw that's causing you to grit your teeth. You imagine that dropping away. And And what he says is, and I think he's right, is that if you take all of those somatosensory supports away from the feeling, you don't end up with anger just sitting there naked and alone in the kind of vacuum of your consciousness. It just disappears. The anger, despite its reality, is produced by the kind of instrumentation of your somatosensory system, creating it and rendering it as a real part of your experience. So that object of anger, I'm kind of thinking of as an analogy to other kinds of objects. So, for example, the object of this cup, I'm just going to return to this cup again, I'm not sure if this is going to be convincing, but this cup, obviously it exists, and I'm completely certain about that, and it has a kind of prototypical transcendental existence, I think, which, as I say, sets the terms for other kinds of existence. But this cup exists in very particular ways. It exists in a way, for me at least, which is visual. The light is bouncing off this cup and entering my eyes, and that's part of its existence for me. Now I can take that away. I can shut my eyes, or I can turn the lights out, or I can just imagine it as those reflections disappearing. But the cup, of course, is still there. I'm not going to deny the reality of the cup. That's just stupid. But I can also take away, imagine at least, taking away its weight. It's being supported in my hand at the moment. But I can imagine that little downward pull that gravity is effecting on this cup. I can imagine that disappearing. So that's gone. But of course, the cup is still there. Then I can imagine what I think of as the feel of this cup. From what I understand, that's the strong and weak electromagnetic forces holding together the molecules of the cup, repelling the strong and weak electromagnetic forces that are operating in my fingertips. But I can kind of imagine those physical forces just ceasing to act for some reason, just ceasing to have an effect. In which case, my fingers are now passing straight through the cup, or something like that, or that repulsion is no longer in existence. But I can kind of conceive the cup being still there, kind of. Then I can imagine myself drinking out of the cup. Of course, the cup is empty. But I can imagine myself drinking out of the cup, and of course the cup is still there, it contains fluids, but I can take away the fluid, I can take away the drinking sensation, I can take away the taste sensation, I can take away the sensory nerve endings in my throat, and I can imagine those things disappearing. So that's gone as well. So all of the instrumentation, all of my sensory tackle, which is created in that cup, or which has given me a sense that cup exists, disappears. I mean, does it make any sense, once you've got that far, to say that the cup still exists? I know that's, in a sense, a stupid philosophical question, because of course it does, because existence is defined by those things. And this is something Percy Bridgman talks about, who's a physicist. And he's talking about how objects themselves, as we understand them, never exist naked, he says. They always exist in contact with the instruments that measure them, even if those instruments are our eyes and our fingertips and our sense of smell and our sense of taste, or they're the extensions of our senses, the various technological instrumentation that extend our senses and provide readings which do become available to our organs. So the very definition of an object it's the impression it's making on the instrumentation. The shape of an object is the impression it makes on your hands and your eyes. The weight of an object is the impression it makes on the proprioceptive senses within your arms and so on. So objects are defined by their instrumentations. And if that's the case with feelings, if those completely real felt objects of human emotions emerge out of the instrumentation of our somatosensory system and disappear when those instruments are removed, and if objects, the real physical objects of the physical world, kind of disappear when you take away the instrumentation by which they are considered to exist, then in that kind of light, what hope really does these conceptual objects that we think of as items of knowledge, articles of data, objects of information, pieces of information, stuff, all this stuff, what hope do we have of suggesting that has any kind of transcendent quality. What right do we have? Where do we get the idea that those things could exist outside of any instrumentation, outside of the instrumentation of our sensory motor systems, outside of the extensions of our sensory motor systems, outside of the collaborative, communal, universal, human sensory motor systems that we find ways of codifying in mathematics and language and all those kinds of things? I don't know, really. But I'm pretty sure they're not transcendent. I'm pretty sure that the idea of my cup did not precede the formation of the earth. And I'm pretty sure that any other kind of object didn't precede the instrumentation by which it becomes available. And I think that would include knowledge objects.